Well, welcome to the university seminar in new media teaching and learning, and we hope that this will be the first of a series that is going to focus on actual teaching and learning and the use of technology in that context. And I'm pleased to welcome back Randall Bass from Georgetown University, who has visited us before and is going to give us an update on the work he's done in the experimental course in conjunction with the Rebirth project that we are also part of at Columbia University. Randy, probably many of you know him. He's the associate provost of the university, Georgetown University that is, and is the director of a center very much like ours called for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, otherwise known as CANDLES, if you're part of the local environment, directly across from one of the better bars in Georgetown called the Tombs. And Randy has a really pivotal role to play at the university. He works really as an academic officer with the purview of the entire curriculum in all the different schools, and at the same time runs a center focused on creating a space for experimentation in the field of pedagogy, assessment, new media, teaching and learning tools. And since the technology is already ahead at the end of the first quarter at 21-0, I think I'm not going to say very much more and turn it over to Randy and let him begin. He's going to tell us about his more recent experiences with a group of undergraduates in the context of the Rebirth archive and some special approaches that he's deployed in engaging those students.
Thank you. And thank you for coming, and it's great to see many of you again, and I'm very happy to be back. So this is a description of a course that has to do with the Project Rebirth, which I'll describe briefly, though I'm assuming that many of you in the room are pretty familiar with Project Rebirth and sort of where we're at, so I'm going to really kind of gallop by that. If anybody wants to slow me down, please do. And if anybody wants to ask a question while we're moving along, please feel free. This course that I taught last spring, I taught in part because I wanted to just engage more deeply with thinking about whatever it is that we're trying to create jointly between Columbia Center and my center vis-a-vis Project Rebirth. So although normally when I like to teach experimentally. I often don't really know what I'm doing. I often just sort of make it up as I go along. This was the first time I ever taught experimentally and made it up as I went along in a course that was tied to a large project in which we don't know what we're doing and we're making up as we go along. So that created this extremely loose and speculative environment. And so really what I'm offering, and as I was putting this together, realized that this was the first time that I started to think about kind of going back over what it is that we thought we were doing and what it is we learned. So this is really all by way of throwing myself on the mercy of the court to say that, you know, I'd like to really, this is very provisional. This is the first time I really was able to put this together, and I'm really welcome exchange around it. That on top of the fact that Frank and I have been at another venue talking nonstop for 6 hours. So any interaction you would like to foment, please feel free. That's interesting. So as most of you probably know, but I'll just go very quickly, Project Rebirth, you know, engages a project that Jim Whitaker, who's the director, who's a Georgetown graduate, who wanted to document the recovery of Ground Zero and set up time-lapse photography cameras around Ground Zero. Up to, there were, I think now at the most, there were 14 time-lapse cameras taking stop-action pictures of Ground Zero every 5 minutes since 2001. So one of the largest time-lapse photography projects ever. And at the same time interviewed what started as 10 and ended up as 9 subjects, each of whom was either, in one case, an actual survivor, somebody above the impact floor, or people who lost someone in the tower collapses, or otherwise had some very strong connection to 9/11 and interviewed them every year for about 8 or 9 years, tracking their recovery. So the project was very much to study recovery both from the standpoint of physical space and from human trajectory of recovery. Out of this project, then, they want to create Jim's vision, and Brian Rafferty, the chairman of the board of directors of Project Rebirth, wants to create a center that will go on to serve victims and survivors of mass trauma. And so the CCNMTL and my center are jointly collaborating around whatever this center will be, some kind of a joint and virtual venture that will link educational materials, help first responders, help connect theory to practice. And that's very much something we're inventing as we go along. The film has had a few private world premieres and will have a public world premiere, I guess, at the Sundance Festival in February, and will be distributed by a real grown-up distributor sometime in the spring. So we've done a number of things with this, including used the archival footage in various classrooms. Several faculty at Columbia have used this archival footage, not just the footage in the film, but the access to 350 hours of subject footage or something like that that exists. These are clips of 4 incredibly eminent people who spoke here at Columbia a year and a half ago in a program. The 2 folks on top are Columbia faculty that you may know, George Bonanno and Kathy Shearer, and then in addition to myself, Bernie Cook, who's a film studies professor at Georgetown. So there have been several faculty who have made use of the footage in classes. In this particular case, I was talking about my use of the footage in teaching first-year writing, when I had my students working with the archival footage and studying what we were then calling the rhetoric of trauma, which is a phrase that I carried into this. Bernie used it in film studies, George and Kathy both at graduate level courses in psychology of various kinds. Just trying to give you a sense of the scope. So there's the film, there's educational uses, and then there's going to be something like the creation of this virtual site that will serve victims and survivors of trauma that we're trying to invent. I think there's a lot of ways to think about what I think of as Project Rebirth's DNA. And these are just a list of some of the things that I tried to take into the course. Trying to think about what is it about the project that isn't at the level of specificity or concreteness, but is in what ways is it a project that can give rise to new kinds of work? And these were some of the things that came up with, and this very much informed the course that I taught. So we've been lurching along with thinking about what this center might be like as we've been waiting for the film to get finished, and the film is about a year behind schedule. So, we've been doing various kinds of speculative sorts of things. But heading into last spring, we thought it might be useful I thought it would be useful, and then Columbia organized a parallel experience to teach a class that really focused on creating materials for the site, or at least imagining what materials for the site might look like. It wasn't merely I wanted to teach another class in which we were making use of the materials in a course, because that was easy enough to do, but I wanted to teach a class in which we were thinking about how is it that a site, a website, a virtual resource could actually serve as a resource for victims or survivors of mass trauma. Or for that matter, what a victim or a survivor of mass trauma is. I mean, we know what it is. We think we know what it is with 9/11, but in a sense, who in New York doesn't think they were a survivor of mass trauma, for example? I mean, so where are the boundaries of even being a victim or a survivor, let alone the boundaries of the next mass trauma? So that was why I wanted to teach this course. Because I have like 5 administrative jobs, I don't have to teach. So I called it an English course, and at some point during the semester, almost everybody in the class said, "Why is this an English course?" We don't really get that. I had a very eclectic set of students. They were all undergraduates, sophomore through senior. I should just mention, and I'd be interested if folks from Columbia want to talk about it later, a parallel seminar or workshop was going on here in which you were exploring the same kinds of issues. Here, the Columbia folks immediately plunged into a very sensible, pragmatic approach in which they looked globally at all kinds of analogs and thought about really useful ways that new social media could serve major global disasters and things. That all seemed incredibly useful. That was not the tack that it occurred to me to take. So this was the non-utilitarian tack that I took. So these were, these were really, some of the kinds of questions that we had in mind. Very general questions. I saw the course as, bringing us to the intersection of, web technologies, thinking about web technologies, a little bit about web theory, pedagogical theory, a little bit about trauma theory. But really the driving questions of the course was ultimately trying to think about something that would be useful, that could help contribute at least to the large-scale and amorphous effort of what does it mean for a virtual resource to serve mass trauma. And for me, the question was very much also around the notion, to try to think of this as a teaching and learning question, as an informal learning question. In what ways could a virtual resource be valuable as a site for informal learning? And it could be that informal learning verges on the therapeutic, which I think it does in many ways anyway. But I wasn't really interested in a virtual resource that was delivering curriculum to teachers or a virtual resource that could be taken as an online course. I was really interested in the question of informal learning in some of the ways that we're just barely beginning to understand that in the web. So in part, we were interested in some of the different ways that the web connects people, that humans connect to each other, that systems have their own intelligences, whether it's through tagging or metadata, right? Systems have intelligence. And as you'll see, I became really interested in the question of accident and serendipity, which seems to me is one of the really important principles of informal learning on the web. So I thought I would just talk about a few, I can share the syllabus. We looked at a lot of different kinds of sites and read a lot of different things, but I thought I would just share with you a few of the inputs to give you a sense of some of the things that we were interested in. So one of the things we were interested in is the work of Jonathan Harris, which some of you may know. I'll show you his site in a moment, but he's an artist who mostly does his work through digital sites in pretty interesting ways. But he has a phrase that I really like, which is that he talks about the web as a planetary meta-organism, which I think is probably a self-explanatory phrase. No, I'm just kidding. How many times has that come up at the dinner table? But I think to me, in a sense, one of the things he means about that is that the web is a really powerful register of who we are as human beings, and that there are ways to manipulate the web that actually can speak back ourselves to ourselves. And I think a lot of his art is about that kind of speaking back and trying to find tools that interpret the web back to us. So, let's see if this is here and available for me. So I don't know how many of you know this site. This is one of his original sites, We Feel Fine. Let's see if I can open this in a separate category, let the JavaScript open. But We Feel Fine is a site that, through data mining, sends out these crawlers all over the world looking for words of affect that appear in blogs all over the world and harvests single sentences with words about feelings in them and then collates them and puts them together in interesting ways. So, so here it says it's looking for feelings from the last few hours. So now the applet's doing its thing. So then you go around randomly and you pick a spot. So this comes from someone who's tagged a photograph somewhere in the world with a feeling sentence.
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, thank you. I was trying to figure out why they were watching their Hewlett-Packard printer or whatever. But, so we'll do another one here. We don't have to dwell on this. So it's just whatever you get, and they come all over the world and from different minutes, and there's ways that it aggregates in interesting ways. You can actually look up cities and see which cities are the happiest cities and the saddest cities, and which cities feel the most, joie de vivre on cloudy days and things like that. It's all correlated to the weather, et cetera. I think the idea is that it's kind of digital performance art. I don't think he's thinking that people are necessarily picking cities to move to, although I suppose somebody might have. But this is part of what he means by the web as a planetary meta-organism, is that there are ways in which we can manipulate tools that help harvest data from the web about kind of human interaction that can deeply inform human interaction. So he sees it in a way having to do with art, but we looked at a lot of his projects, and he has a lot of projects if you go to his website, and other ones like them, because that seemed like one really interesting place to look at the non-utilitarian possibilities for a site that would serve victims of mass trauma, or what it means to even think about the role of the web as a place where we think about something so complicated as what it means to develop a sense of, to recover, or to find other people who are recovering from a sense of mass trauma. So that was one key input. Entirely different input that we looked at. Somebody who I met a year and a half ago when I was in Australia, whose work I really like, a guy named Tim Castell, who studies how it is that websites add value in open source business models. So he particularly studies journalism and music, and who's making money on the web and how are they making it, and he has a whole set of writings around this triad of aggregate, filter, and connect, that the businesses that have figured out how to make money are the ones that understand how to, people value the aggregation of resources, particular kinds of filtering of resources, and then ways in which those resources connect you to other things. So you could even think about like Amazon.com does all three of those things, right? Pulls together all the publishers' stuff, that's aggregation, filters it in certain ways, with reviews and whatnot, and connects, tells you that if you like this book, you might like this book, right? I mean, there's lots of sites that do this. But his work was generative for us thinking about, again, what are the aggregation, filtering, and connecting functions potentially of a site like this. We read various kinds of trauma theory. This happens to be one essay called The Victim as Culture Hero. But we read some other stuff, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But one of the things that was interesting about reading trauma theory, and some of you may be even more deeply familiar with it than I am, was that it gave us, as you'll see in a minute with the first project that we did, there's kind of a standard way of thinking about identity and subjectivity in trauma as dividing the self before the traumatic event or before the crisis, the self during that crisis, so if you think about Holocaust literature, slave narratives, and the self after. And that those three divisions very much are, kind of very, very deep epistemological differences in the way that one narrates and identifies oneself in a trauma. He also talks about various things like dialectical integration, which is his phrase for how it is that a victim of trauma or a survivor of trauma comes to really understand themselves as two selves, as the person before and the person after, and the gulf between those two selves, and how really who they are is very much defined by that doubleness. And then, of course, a standard in trauma theory of the importance of the witness and the audience, which also seemed particularly important if we were talking about the web. Read some new media theory. Some of you may know Lev Manovich's book, Language of New Media. He has one of the more valuable pieces in that is talking about the tension between the narrative and the database. The narrative was the dominant paradigm of the 20th century and the 19th century. The novel was the dominant genre of narrative in the 19th century, turned into film, but still narrative was our dominant paradigm. It says the dominant paradigm of the 21st century is the database, right? And he describes in slightly bloggy, melodramatic terms that the database and narrative are enemies, right? That narrative needs continuity and structure and arc, and database wants to continuously dissolve itself and reconstitute itself relationally. So, but at the very least, thinking about the tension between narrative arcs and the databases is interesting, and that especially bears when you think about something like the Project Rebirth archive. Over, part of the power of Project Rebirth is that you have these interviews with the same subjects over 7, 8, 9 years of their recovery. You have a real sense of depth of following people through the entire arc of their recovery. And yet, what does it mean when you start slicing that up into 1-minute segments and 3-minute segments and 5-minute segments? And so you can imagine the way the tension and tension between narrative and database even plays out there. So that gives you just a sense of some of the range of things that we looked at. It was kind of all over the place, but that was really an important part of the course. And then at the same time, we did sort of deep dives into the Rebirth archive. And the one thing I didn't bring up is I didn't bring up Vital. This is actually just a well-placed infomercial for the Columbia Center for New Media Teaching and Learning. It's like the Truman Show. I love Vital. I could not have taught this course without Vital. So while we were doing this reading, my students were doing what we were calling deep dives into the archive and working extensively with the footage. We had different assignments every week, which I didn't detail, but where they were watching footage and then posting to the blog and identifying different kinds of connections to our readings. I didn't ask them to, but it turned out that everybody sort of identified one person that they adopted. So one person just became the Ling guy, and one person became the Nick, the high school kid who lost his mother while he was a junior in high school. There's a couple people who just really identified with Nick, and a couple people who really identified with Tim, the fireman, etc. So, and they watched hours and hours and hours of this footage. And one of the things that's really quite fascinating about the footage, the raw footage, is that, I think Jim did a very good job of picking compelling, charismatic people, but you're watching this footage and it just rolls for hours. And I personally, and as did my students, just found it endlessly compelling. To just watch, no matter what they were talking about, we're fascinated by it. Which that's not the easiest thing to do with undergraduates, is to find something that will just rivet them for hours and hours. But so it was very interesting how the students were very intrigued, and that part of the power of this is the depth, thinking about that narrative database and how important it is to give people a chance to do these deep dives. But that was a very important part of the course. So, like I say, we used Vital, went in and out. So after a few weeks, the students who had been lured into the course by my promise that we were actually going to try to make something useful that would help the creators of this virtual resource, meaning you and me and you guys. And they said, when are we going to do something? It's like, it's not a question they would ever have asked in any other class, but it was like, when are we going to actually stop learning and actually do something and make something? So we decided that it was time to do something, to learn something by doing something. And so I don't remember exactly how it is that I came to decide that what we were going to do was this grid exercise, but it seemed that what we wanted to do was to start with something fairly structured. And our model here was a project that we had worked on at Georgetown. Just a second, I'm just going to tell my email to shut up. A project that we'd worked on at Georgetown called the Digital Storytelling Multimedia Archive. This previous project that I was here talking about before this, some of you may have heard me talk about the Visible Knowledge Project, had a lot of faculty doing digital stories. And so this was a secondary project in which a group of people tried to study student learning that was going on in digital storytelling. What happens, what do students actually learn when they engage in digital storytelling? So this was a fairly extensive site that studied that. But one of the ways that, an alternative way that we reorganized some of the findings was in this grid. And you probably can't see it very well at all here. Let's see if I'm going to try to make it just a skosh bigger here. That helps a little bit, doesn't it? So across the top, we have the 3 dimensions of learning that we were tracking: rethinking expertise, emotions and argument, and student engagement. So these were three big dimensions of learning outcomes we were studying. And then along the left-hand axis here, we had different dimensions of what happens when students author in multimedia. They think about audience, they engage in editing, they engage in something we call compression, where they focus on single moments as having impact, layers, and authoring. So these were kind of like specific to multimedia. These were big outcomes. And the way that this grid worked is you would click on an intersection between those two things. So what do we mean by compression? How does it intersect with emotions and argument? There's a little definition of the finding, right? And then we had clips that were associated with it. So I'll just play this real quick. So this is an example of a student talking about this intersection of emotions and compression in the context of constructing a multimedia argument. So anyway, so this was kind of our inspiration. We thought, well, what if we thought about creating a grid like this in which Project Rebirth clips would end up, and they would be somehow arranged on two axes. Just to disappoint all suspense, we never actually got that far. So, meaning building a high-end Flash-oriented grid thing, a bobber. But we did do the grid exercise, and this is sort of where we went. So I tried to use this as a heuristic. I tried to say, well, what if we then use this grid exercise to help organize the knowledge that we were developing in the course? So part of it was we started by saying, okay, well, everybody agreed that one of the axes had to be time, right? In this case, one of the axes had to be time. And we decided that we weren't, after much discussion, you have to imagine this played out with a group of undergraduates over endless packages of Oreos and pretzels and things like that, week in and week out, that we weren't interested in chronological time necessarily. We were interested in something which we had taken from something else, this temporal modeling, temporal visualization project that had been done out at the University of Virginia, what they called the now slider. But that we were interested in subjective time, which is, it wasn't necessarily the timeline of year by year, it was the timeline of where the subject thought they were at the time, of what time they were speaking. Right? So the temporal modeling project, we had read some things about it. And it was the source of this particular concept. So we basically just worked with those four temporal categories: before the event, during the event, after the event, and the future. Right? Those latter two being distinct. So then the debate, that turned out to be the easy part. Then the debate was, what is it that goes down the other axis of the grid? And we went through many reasonable things, different categories. People had been tagging clips like crazy. So we had hundreds of keyword tags associated with all of the deep dives and every single clip in the deep dive. So we went through all these different possibilities and eschewed all of them for something more basic. And we lighted on this notion that the left-hand axis was merely these basic dimensions and expressions of identity. Who am I? Where am I? What am I feeling? What will I do? And then this kind of meta category, which is what am I saying, which is sort of like where people were talking about the problem of expressing themselves, which again, if you've read much Holocaust literature or theory of Holocaust literature, focusing on actually the ineffability of articulating the trauma as an important theme. So that ended up looking like that grid. That was our grid matrix. And then we engaged in an exercise where the students went back and they harvested out clips that they had encountered on their deep dive and figured out where they would place them on the grid. So those are the sliding glass writable doors of the conference room that I taught in. And so that was our grid project. So everybody placed their Post-it notes on the grid. But that was great. In some ways, it was a very tactile exercise. But you can also see how certain cells became much more intuitive than others. So that's what it looks like. That's what it looked like on paper. So we became very interested we decided to to try to focus on 3 different areas. So we picked a row across, meaning what happens if we sort of focused on just feeling all the way across all 3 time zones. We focused just on 1 time zone across all identity questions, and then 1 cell, which happened to be at the corner of future and do. And the idea here was merely to have students then randomly put together playlists out of any of these cells or out of any of these directions to see if something interesting would come out of it. And the theory we were working on here was structure in, serendipity out. And structure in, meaning that there's a reason you put something somewhere, and then accidental meaning coming out, serendipity out. And
Sounds like life itself.
well, possibly, or the web itself. And I guess to me, the kind of structure in, serendipity out is a kind of really fundamental principle of informal learning on the web. And so that was my reasoning. I mean, I had a reason.
You mean serendipity is output, not as out of the picture, just to clarify.
Yes, serendipity is output. Right. Structured input, serendipity is output. Thank you for that gentle correction. Yeah. No, well, anyway, yeah. So the idea was that actually meaning could be made by conjunction, although part of it is that serendipity might be the result of system intelligence linking through tagging or humans making connections accidentally. It isn't as if it's utterly random in the way that in some ways Jonathan Harris's work is pretty random. This would be much less than random, or much more than random. I'm not sure how that goes, but anyway, this just gives you a sense of, the students writing about, here's somebody who's done, and the after playlist. This is just a grab from one of the students' papers. I'll just give you a chance to look at that. So one of the things I liked about this exercise, and I guess I really approached this whole course and this exercise very much as a humanities person, or as one of the last vestiges of being actually an English professor, although my colleagues would say there are none of those left, is that that by not just working at like, I'm going to look at 3 things that were all tagged with the same keyword, which is one of the things that we might have done, it actually forced them to look below the surface, to think about what is it that's continuity that is not obvious. So it struck us as pretty interesting when we were watching these playlists, that you can begin with this story of this playful story in the kitchen with the soccer hat and end up talking about body parts and refrigeration. And so like here's some of the things that, from the convergence of those 4 things together, that struck us is like emerges from thinking about these as a playlist, the range of what it means to try to imagine your, the loved body. Or recovering bodies, the way that she's essentially recovering Sergio's body in that story in the kitchen, as much as people are talking about recovering bodies from the site or identifying them. Or the different constructs of trying to preserve a sense of affect and memory so that doesn't fade or disappear. Or that the way that the past is embedded in the future or the future in the past. I mean, these all seem like really subtle kinds of things that are very hard to get at with tagging that emerge through the kind of accident of juxtaposition. So that was the grid exercise, and that was one of the 2 major things that we did that helped us try to understand what it is we were encountering. I think there's a lot more to explore there. I don't know that a grid is ultimately the thing that we want to end up with, but I think there's a lot more to explore around how you could input things, what the relationship is between subjective time and chronology. One of the things that did strike us that we didn't study was it would be really interesting to look at language that was about subjective time in relationship to chronological time. How could you actually tell when somebody is actually regressing in their recovery based on whether in later years they're using language of previous subjective time and that kind of thing. And we played around a little bit with different kinds of metadata visualization. Some of you may know the presidential speech called the Presidential Slider Project, I think it is. But there's like all the inaugural addresses since the first inaugural address are put in a database, and you can slide along a single timeline and watch all the keywords change and just get a really quick glimpse of just how the issues of history change over time. So we started playing with some sliders of gender and interviewees and et cetera around years. So I think there's a lot more that could be done around that. So I'm just going to hasten here to the end. This is so then we did the next step was they said, okay, now we want to build something, because even though they thought the grid exercise was interesting, they didn't think it was as interesting as I did. And so now what about now what? So then we had this assignment where they developed these pitch proposals, which I'm not going to talk about much because to me this was just one of those really interesting things that happens in pedagogy that happens to me a lot, the way that I teach, is that this became a step where I realized that they didn't know enough to actually do what we were trying to do. So they had to develop these pitch proposals for a site or a part of a site that would address mass trauma, and identify a use case scenario, what kind of research would be needed, et cetera. And they developed these pitch proposals. There were these significant papers, and in a way, it kind of does the reverse of what you saw in the grid exercise. It starts with big conceptual knowledge, and then tries to figure out like which web tools they already know about could actually carry out this particular kind of concept. So I decided that this was not going to be very interesting. I won't make you read that. So we kind of plunged back into theory, and I had them then read a whole set of new things on narrative theory, and some Jerome Bruner, and back into trauma and witnessing theory, Shoshana Feldman and Dory Laub. Read some of George Bonanno and some of his interesting work on the difference between resilience versus recovery, et cetera. And we ended up with a vision for what people wanted to work on as their final projects was to imagine that there were three fundamental things that a site could do. There would be a place for stories, a place for community, and a place for connections, making connections. And then the students in the group kind of divvied up into these. And mostly they were trying to imagine what would it mean to even imagine, what would be a kind of micro exercise that would be playful with the kind of functionality that a site could have. So I think I'm going to skip the stories project, which is probably the weakest of the three and the most self-evident. And just show you a little bit of a couple of other projects, and then we can talk about it. Let me just talk through this project. Because again, it doesn't really play very well as a digital story. Then I'll play you one that plays pretty well as a digital story for most of it. So this project was working on connections, and they were working on the question of tagging and metadata, but they were also really interested in how the notion of trauma and emotion traversed across different kinds of trauma. So they actually went out and found Georgetown students who had experienced personal trauma and interviewed them. And they did two things. One was that they asked them a series of questions they asked them what moves you backward, what moves you forward, and what just helps you cope, and asked them to just write down keywords that came to mind. So this was someone who'd lost their father in a plane crash, someone whose mother had died of cancer, et cetera. They were all personal, not mass trauma, but personal trauma. The other thing they did was they showed all of these subjects the same 5 Project Rebirth clips and asked them to write down their thoughts. And for a couple of them, they just actually had to stop and could not go on with that part of it, that it was just too much. So they played around with a lot of these. They kept, trying to find what were some of the words that came up again and again, and then found that there were certain things like remembering that moved them both forwards and backwards. I'm just going to let this kind of playing with ways to kind of mix language against image, language against language, and then as you'll see in a minute, language against the rebirth clips. All of them were really working in a mode of playful and generative remix. Like what is it that was interesting about finding new ways to juxtapose the rebirth content in the broadest sense. So that's really what's going on here. Oops. Did I lose my... These words are all words that have been harvested from talking to these Georgetown students who had all suffered perfect personal loss. So these are all things that they had written down in this exercise of what moves you forward, what moves you backwards, and what helps you cope. So this is a collection of all the coping words. And then, again, as part of their project, they then drop in a Project Rebirth voiceover. Oops. Oops. Did I not bring the... No, I guess so. Sorry. Similarly here, each of these phrases, what was going to play over those coping words, I'll come back to this because you won't be able to stare at it, is the same clip that will hopefully play on this other clip. I don't know why this one isn't playing. So let me just show you this last project, and I can go back and talk about that. I don't know why I don't have that last slide in there. So the last project was focusing on the question of community and what it means to build community. And they got really interested in somewhere where I sent them to look as a source in what's known as the Buffalo Creek disaster, which was a major flood that took place in West Virginia in 1972. And Kai Erickson, the sociologist who's just retired from Harvard, wrote a great book about that called Everything in Its Path, in which he went to study for the insurance company, do interviews for that. Ended up producing this book. Was really a meditation on what community was and what was lost as this sludge dam broke and went down this holler. And as the flood went down this holler, it took, like 6 towns with it and just basically flushed everything down to the bottom of the holler, and they relocated everybody in these mobile homes at the foot of the mountain and didn't put them back together in any of the ways that resembled the towns that had been washed out. So all of a sudden everybody was living this close to people they didn't know, et cetera. So it becomes a very interesting meditation on what a neighbor is, what a community is, what are the threads of community, et cetera. So they got really interested in that. So they put together a project that just tried to do this kind of micro juxtaposition of thinking about what is it like to remix rebirth materials with primary materials that came out of the Buffalo Creek disaster. So I'm going to play you about 2/3 of their final project. But I think that they did a really interesting job of trying to weave in the rebirth materials. And I think what the students became especially interested in was the dissolution of boundaries between the rebirth materials and other materials, and the kind of transmedial ways of communicating whatever the deep meaning is in the rebirth materials, how you can play with language, how you can use the language of keywords and meta tagging playfully to try to lift out meaning from the rebirth materials, what it's like to try to remix them with other sources of trauma. So I don't know where that ultimately leads, but I think that on the one hand, pedagogically, I think the students found that it was both, that they could use the material both expressively and that it was constitutive in the sense that it was a way for them to make sense of what it was they were doing about what are the cultural dimensions of trauma, how does media play into our notion of what it means to try to recover or try to connect. I think also, what does it suggest for a site? I don't think that we really made a lot of progress in that regard. I think it'd be really interesting to more fully realize what it's like to remix some of the digital stories. I think if I were to teach it again, I would definitely begin the remix projects much earlier in the course. Teach them how to mix audio and control sound levels. I would definitely do that. I think one of the things that we became very interested in was the way in which one might be able to imagine a site provoking similar stories to their own, the way that the materials could actually provoke you to think about your own connections. And I think that it would be very interesting. We looked some at the Music Genome Project and all of the 400 attributes that they use to code music in the Music Genome Project, and to think about what would be the analogy to a trauma video genome project. I don't have a conclusion. I've thought of calling this a 5-act course in 4 acts. I think in many ways that we ran out of time in the course, but I think that we did get to a point where we were at least being very playful with the rich layers of meaning that are embedded in the Rebirth materials. And I think that as we think about what the site can be, it's easy to think about all of the very pragmatic and utilitarian ways that we could imagine creating a virtual resource to connect people to therapeutic resources in their neighborhood and to help particular families just talk to each other in virtual communities. I do think that there's a body of knowledge about the deeper dynamics of how informal learning can help people form identifications and develop resilience as a virtual community that we actually know very little about. So that was really what I think we were chasing after. I think we just learned a little tiny bit about that.